Thank you. Okay, I am here today to talk about fake news, both the phenomenon and the phrase itself. So first, the phenomenon. What is fake news? Maybe the best way to get into it is to look at a few stories that have been called by this name. It is a name. And there will be a quiz in a moment, but just as a warm-up, let's start with one of the biggest fake news stories in the US over the past year, and that's this one. That Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump in the US presidential election. This circulated widely in the run-up to Election Day. Now, this story is made up. Pope Francis didn't endorse either major candidate in the US election, and it kind of seemed like he really especially didn't like Donald Trump. But this story, it got started on a satire news website. It was a joke. But then it got picked up by a blog that reported it as straight news, and by Election Day, it had over 900,000 engagements on Facebook. So here's your quiz question. Is this story fake news? Australia becomes the first country to start microchipping its citizens. Raise your hand if this story looks like fake news to you. Okay, so we've got kind of a mixed reaction here, and that means that you're savvy because this is tricky. It's not entirely untrue, but it is misleading. So this article is based on an Australian mainstream news report, and that report said that a small number of people have chosen to have RFID chip implants. I was delighted to talk about Zoltar earlier today. The only thing that this article really adds to that older story is this kind of new, vague, scary framing about how RFID chips could someday be used to control people. So this headline misleadingly suggests that there's some sort of official effort by the Australian government to microchip its citizens, and that's definitely not true. But this example shows how tricky the term fake news is. Is this story fake? Well, not entirely, but it's not totally true or real either. It puts a misleading and kind of paranoid frame around these nuggets of information that it gets right. And these are just a few examples of the kinds of news stories that get called fake, right? So it's a big category. It's stories that are misleading, stories that just got the facts wrong, or stories that are totally made up. And this is something that's happening all around the world: India, Brazil, Italy, United States, Sweden, many other places as well. Now, this news story is real. The kids magazine, Bamse, here in Sweden, is teaching kids to be critical about the sources of fake news. And that shows us just how widespread the concern over the reliability of information has become, and how fake news works as a catchphrase to sum up that concern. So even the ways that people think and talk about the notion of fake news are really important, and that's what I want to focus on today. What if we think of fake news not just as a thing that's happening, but as a phrase and an idea? And more largely, what do words and ideas about media content reveal about how people understand the world? So I ask these kinds of questions because I'm a media historian and theorist. Once I finished my PhD in communication, I started at Data and Society, which is a nonprofit research institute in New York. We research the cultural and social issues that come up as data-driven systems become a central part of our everyday lives. And Data and Society recently published the Lexicon of Lies. You can see right up here a guide that I wrote about terms for problematic information. You can download it from datasociety.net. So I'm going to touch on a few of the points from the Lexicon of Lies and some of the other work that I do with DNS in this talk. But first, I want to tell you a little story, because looking to the past can help us start to understand this idea of fake news. The idea that the media's power can be misused isn't new. So one way of shifting the view is to think about propaganda. And that sounds like something different from fake news, but for the group I'm going to tell you about, the idea of propaganda did something that might feel quite familiar. So it was in 1937 that a group of educators, scholars, and writers in New York City started the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And an important aside here, when I mention propaganda in the 1930s, it's natural to think of the notorious propaganda of the Nazi regime or other wartime government media. Now, the IPA's definition included that stuff, but also lots of other things: advertising, radio news, political speeches, even entertainment. And the IPA published essays, newsletters, and study guides like the one you see here. And the idea was to create a strong general method for people to use on media messages, almost a citizen science of media consumption. So the IPA wanted to help people learn to recognize news sources, to see a source trying to scapegoat or stereotype people, and to notice when writers or speakers try to stir up fear or anger or excitement in the audience. And the IPA thought that if people could recognize propaganda and reason their way through it, then that could protect democracy. Now, the IPA stopped its operations when the US entered the Second World War, which is a whole different story, but their techniques for critical thinking are still with us, and they get taught in media literacy classes. So I might ask, though, what could we learn from the short life of the Institute for Propaganda Analysis? Well, the media scholar Fred Turner has pointed out that in the 1930s, people in many countries were concerned that the media technologies of radio and film made mass audiences. And mass audiences were concerning because they could mean mass political movements. So this was an anxious time. During the first few decades of the 20th century, there had been huge changes in how people lived and worked. There were new and in some cases troubling political ideas circulating, and in the US, some old troubling political ideas like white supremacy and anti-Semitism, both of which got their share of airtime on radio and film. So we can learn that people responded to a big, complex mess of concerns by focusing on one part, audience members, and how they could think critically about media content. So if you imagine this illustration behind me is the whole social world. You've got lots of different parts rubbing up against each other. And I put an arrow there to point out the radio and the mobile phone and the media devices way down there in the corner. The whole messy room is at stake, but the media devices in the corner are often what we focus on. So from that perspective, it's easy to see that terms like propaganda and fake news might serve a certain purpose. We could call them shorthand words. They're a quick way to signal a big mess of problems. And these shorthand words are useful because they're call-outs. They let people point to situations that go against their expectations for media and how it should be used and say, that thing right there, that's not okay. Now, this power to call out can be abused. We've seen that in the United States, where the president calls our press fake news. So it's really important to dig into the particular worldviews and expectations that people are drawing on when they use this phrase. So if I call out media content as fake news or propaganda, I'm not just saying that the content isn't true or real. I'm saying that it doesn't live up to my ideas about how media should help citizens in a democracy. So the propaganda analysts in the 1930s believed that the stuff they called propaganda was harmful. It short-circuited citizens' reasoning abilities. And critics today believe that the stuff we call fake news is harmful because it deprives citizens of the ability to make informed decisions. So to put it another way, shorthand words like propaganda and fake news are not just about media content, although they are about that. They're also about the context of democratic citizenship. But media have often become the focus of people's anxieties and hopes. And problems that actually involve media and politics and social power come to be defined as media problems. So if fake news and propaganda are shorthand words, and if they express hopes and worries about the role the media can play in a democratic society, and if media themselves are just part of a big, complicated mess, then what? Well, it can lead us to ask, what other words are there for talking about media content that's troubling? And how do those different terms shape understandings? So that's what I explore in the Lexicon of Lies, and we'll visit a little bit of that now. As it turns out, there are a ton of words for talking about media, for talking about the accuracy of stories, why people share them, what kinds of effects they can have. Terms like misinformation and disinformation, information operations, public relations, propaganda, hoaxes, and satire. And when you look in the dictionary, you find that there are small but important differences in the meanings of these various terms. But in many cases, they're not mutually exclusive. They overlap. In other words, the terms we use aren't as simple as they might seem. So just to give you an example, the terms misinformation and disinformation. Both terms refer to media content that's made up, misleading, or gets the facts wrong. But the difference is intent. What did the person putting out the information mean to do? So here's one example. This tweet went out from the official account of the British Daily Express newspaper shortly after the bombing attack on an Ariana Grande concert. And the newspaper later deleted this tweet and updated its reporting to reflect that there was no evidence of a man with a gun at the hospital. So this looks like a clumsy case of misinformation, but a case of misinformation, an honest mistake. At least they tried to correct it. But compare that case to multiple Twitter accounts that reported an explosion and toxic fume hazard at a chemical plant in the American South in September of 2014. The YouTube video you see here was part of what appeared to be a detailed and coordinated campaign. This included supposedly eyewitness videos, live tweets from multiple Twitter accounts, copycat sites made to look like the local news websites, and even text messages to local residents' mobile phones. No explosion had taken place at Colombian Chemicals, but somebody was trying really hard to make it look like one had. And the journalist Adrian Chen has written about this at length, and he believes that that campaign was put out by a Russian organization called the Internet Research Agency, so you can read more about that. These two examples, they seem pretty different, right, in terms of what the people behind the content meant to do. But it gets messier when we consider that these messages got spread around on social media. Well-intended people use social media systems designed for easy sharing to pass these pieces of content along to their networks of friends, coworkers, and other folks they know. And indeed, some automated retweeting happened as well. So the line between misinformation and disinformation starts to get a little blurry. Whose intent counts? Now, my hunch is that shorthand words like fake news pop up at moments like this exactly because they're not precise. Their vagueness just lets people communicate the uncertainty of the moment. But as we saw earlier, these words draw our attention only to the media aspect of a much bigger mess of people, technologies, ideas, economic pressures, which makes it tempting to pursue individual, media-oriented solutions to society-level problems, even though media is just one part of what's going on. Okay, so why does any of this matter? Because words shape our world. Words matter. Words matter because they affect the ways we imagine the world to be, and that, in turn, influences the ways we try to make it better. And that doesn't mean we just need to choose our words more carefully and everything will be okay, unfortunately. But it means we can start to see and talk about how real events are a lot messier than the words we use to describe them. So fake news is a shorthand word that signals a big mess of social concerns. Its vagueness is useful for reflecting how people feel unsure about which news stories to trust. But its focus on media orients people towards media solutions that only address one part of the problem. When I started writing the Lexicon of Lies, I thought I was writing a categories guide, a guide to how to tell hoaxes from satire, how to tell misinformation from disinformation. But as the research went on, I realized it became more of a conversation about how it seems like it should be easy to tell those things apart, but it's actually very hard. And maybe we need new words, new metaphors, new models. So when we hear the term fake news, we can see it as being about media content and media context. There's a lot of misleading information out there, but the phrase and the idea of fake news represents more than that. It speaks to how those misleading, made up, or just plain wrong stories fall short of how media are supposed to work in a democracy. So I'd like to invite you to dwell with me in the mess and start opening up that conversation with the people around you about how there is no easy fix for our media troubles, because they're not just media troubles. There are society troubles, democracy troubles, and a whole set of long-standing concerns about representation, persuasion, and power that get focused and expressed through terms like propaganda and fake news. Thank you.